Okay, we've got a ranger trapped behind a podium and a mic, so bear with me as I start doing this and realize I have to come back. So thank you to Chris Gwynn and Gettysburg National Military Park for having me come today. This is a great honor and I'm very excited to be here. I've been at Cedar Creek and Belgrove National Historical Park since 2010, so I'm part of the foundational team of Interp. And I'd like to ask by a show of hands how many people have been there. Oh, yay. Oh, that's exciting. Oh, come back. For those of you who haven't, we welcome you to come anytime. I've got some brochures and some of our planning for our 2016 schedule. We offer a really diverse amount of program considering how small our staff is. We will start our daily programming, our seasonal interim spring programming, which will be based totally on how many seasonals I've had start. So definitely on March 19th, we'll be doing some programs. And then we'll pick up by May and June, we'll get back into our daily programs. We offer a great History at Sunset series, which will be every other Friday night through May through October. And we cover all the themes of the Shenandoah Valley. We're not just a Civil War park, but we're supposed to cover the geological formation of the valley. And so far, we don't have a ranger who's the nature ranger yet, so we'll get to that one eventually. But again, the American Indians, the settlement of the valley, the age of grain, and then, of course, the crash towards the Civil War. And then while we are at the Cedar Creek battlefield, we do programming for all of the Civil War sites. So we've got Jackson's campaign of 1862. We've got 2nd Winchester, which, of course, leads into the Battle of Gettysburg. And then we do a lot of programs for 64, which is quite a mess in the Shenandoah Valley. I'm sure many of you all are familiar. You've been to Gettysburg once or twice, and you realize that they've been talking about this battle since the day it ended. And we don't quite have that luxury at Cedar Creek. We are learning everything from scratch. So while I've been at the park for 6 seasons, I feel like I just kind of know a little bit. And I was very excited when Chris asked me to do this program because this provided a great opportunity for new research. What happened to the Shenandoah Valley after the Civil War? And this is a quote from a resident of Frederick County, our once beautiful but now desolated valley, post-war Shenandoah Valley. And when I discuss the devastation, I'm often struck by a quote from a woman by the name of Ellen Key. Now, Ellen Key is not from that era. She's actually a suffragette from the World War I era. And she said, "The worst barbarity of war is that it forces men collectively to commit acts against which individually they would revolt with their whole being." And I think that's pretty profound probably for any war that has ever occurred. Now, the Civil War profoundly disrupted the lives of ordinary men and women in the Shenandoah Valley. On the home front, those that were left behind struggled to keep going, to run farms and the industries, to make do despite great shortages. When the home front was transformed into a battlefield, when their private foodstuffs were plundered by marauding soldiers, and when children were forced to salvage the nails from barns that were destroyed, the memory of war became hard to shake, even generations later. For the newly freed people, the post-war experience was a dramatic period filled with profound changes of government and social norms. For the white society who truly believed in the inferiority of the African race, these changes would be met with great resistance. Now, this is Mary Stickley, much later in life. At the time of the Civil War, in 1862, when Stonewall Jackson's campaign came through, she would have been about 8 or 10 years old. And by 64, when Cedar Creek raged through her property, she would have been about 10 or 12. And I think Mary Stickley embodies what it must have been like for a child to live through such an extraordinary time. And in the aftermath of war, in the 1880s, I believe, there was a travel writer who came through and started collecting the stories of those who survived. And Mary gives us some great accounts and insights. And this is what she said about 1862. "We couldn't keep anything that was good, and we thought we were having a hard time, but affairs weren't quite so dizzy those days as they would be later in the war." Now, this is the house that still stands right on Cedar Creek. And on the morning of October 19th, 1864, the battle would rage right around this house. Her house would become a hospital. For a 10 or 12-year-old child, I can't even fathom what that must be like. And this is what she says about that time. "The wounded of both armies were brought to our house till every room downstairs was full, and the yard outside was filled too. They just lay them on the floor or on the grass with maybe a blanket or an overcoat under them. The surgeons took anything they could for bandages. They brought them here and kept them here in a field behind my house. I never experienced so many stirring events any other day of my life." I can't even begin to grasp that. At 10 or 12, that is the most stirring day of your life. Now, the family still owns this property, and according to one of the gentlemen, they knew her as Aunt Mary. And the way he put it essentially was that Aunt Mary was always known to be a little bit off. But can you imagine? I mean, we're so lucky that we haven't faced war on the home front. Now, what's fascinating in the upper corner here is their dining room table, which was used as the surgeon's table. And that's now stored in Frederick at the National Civil War Medical Museum. So when you guys come down to visit us at Cedar Creek, stop in and see the table. So now, after the war, Mary recalled that her family had a hard struggle to get started up again. "We were dreadfully broken up by the war. We didn't have anything hardly, and we had to go mighty far to get our first meats. The fences were all gone. Our only horse was a broken-down army horse that was picked up on the battlefield." Again, can you imagine living through something like that? And after such devastating consequences of war, how did these various communities rebuild themselves after or during such an uncertain time? Now, during the course of this program, I will discuss 3 groups and how they rebuilt their communities. Of course, just like wartime experience, for each individual, they have a personal story. For every story told, there are countless ways for how each person made it through the aftermath of war. But for the purposes of this program, I'm going to discuss 3 different aspects of this post-war period. Now, first, I will discuss the importance of the agricultural region of the Shenandoah Valley and how it rebuilt. Second, I will discuss the Ladies Memorial Association and their political involvement in the Shenandoah Valley. And finally, I'm going to discuss what it was like for African Americans in the post-war Shenandoah. Now, our beautiful Shenandoah Valley runs approximately 180 miles from southwest to northeast. According to historian Nancy Sorrells, by the 1790s, the Shenandoah Valley had become the #1 wheat and flour producing regions in the entire South. By 1820, Frederick County, which is where Winchester is, became the #1 flour producer in the state. And by 1850, 96% of farmers of the valley produced wheat. Wheat, corn, and oats were also significant in their own right, but cattle, swine, and horses in particular were also vital. The valley counties were among the state's leaders in beef and dairy cattle at the war's outset. So hence this region becomes known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Now, another important impact of commerce in the valley, now here's the pretty valley, was the Valley Turnpike. Today you guys might know it as US Route 11. Before the war, the valley carried cash crops, especially milled flour, to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And from these coastal centers, merchants can sell throughout the Western Hemisphere as well to the northern cities. Now, when the Valley Turnpike Company initially made its stock available to the public, people in the Shenandoah Valley counties came out in droves to purchase most of the shares. But a substantial number of purchases were also from Baltimore, Maryland, and that's very important. Now, stockholder lists identify that Valley Pike investor locations predominantly were in the towns that the pike ran through, or certainly the counties, but not towns or counties outside of where the pike was. So the connection north with Baltimore did not diminish after the Civil War. Instead, Baltimore's grasp on the valley only tightened. But let's talk about the war for a moment. Now, the Shenandoah Valley is going to become an important theater of war, and a lot of it has to do with its geography. The southwest to northeast corridor makes it a great backdoor approach to the Union capital of Washington, D.C., so the Confederates take great advantage of that. Of course, I mentioned the breadbasket of the Confederacy, so it's a great place to provide food for the soldiers coming through. And of course, because of that great roadway, which was so important moving commerce pre-war, becomes a great avenue for invasion and moving troops and supplies. Now, by 1864, the tactics of war will change from a limited war to a total war, and the Shenandoah Valley will be hit by the hard hand of war. A 13-day burning campaign would occur late September into early October. And to understand the devastations of this campaign, General Philip Sheridan will write to General Ulysses S. Grant an account of this. And Sheridan states, "The whole country from the Blue Ridge to North Mountain has been made untenable for a rebel army. I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat, hay, and farming implements, over 70 mills filled with wheat and flour. 4 herd of cattle have been driven before the army, and not less than 3,000 sheep have been killed and issued to these troops. The destruction embraces the Little Fork and Luray valleys as well as the main valley. Tomorrow I will continue the destruction of wheat, forage, etc. down to Fisher's Hill. When this is completed from the valley, Winchester up to Stanton, 92 miles, will have little in it for man or beast." So that's the account of the official record. But what was the human impact of such destruction? And there was a northern news correspondent traveling with Sheridan, and this is what he wrote about what he saw. "The poor, alike with the rich, have suffered. Some have lost their all. The wailing of women and children, mingling with the crackling of flames, has sounded from scores of dwellings. I have seen mothers weeping over the loss of that which was necessary for their children, setting aside their own, their last cow, their last bit of flour pilfered by stragglers, the last morsel they had in the world to eat or drink. Young girls with flushed cheeks, or pale with tearful or tearless eyes, have pleaded with or cursed the men whom the necessities of war have forced them to burn the buildings reared by their fathers and turn them into paupers in a day. The completeness of this desolation is awful." Now, after such destruction, how did residents rebuild their agricultural region? Historians claim another number of factors allowed this to happen. First, you're going to have the former enslaved force transitioning into hired labor. You're also going to have movement towards mechanization on the farm, such as reapers and threshing machines. But there's going to be an economic incentive. And if you remember, I mentioned the important connection with Baltimore prior to the Civil War. Well, there's going to be a group of businessmen in Baltimore who feel that Virginia as a whole, but particularly the Valley, needs to be stabilized. From their report, the Baltimore Agricultural Aid Society of 1865, they explain what their objective is. And it states, "Shortly after the close of the Civil War, which devastated so large a portion of the southern states, and more particularly the neighboring state of Virginia, leaving thousands of people in a state of utter destitution without the means of cultivating their lands or procuring the necessary implements and seed to enable them to avoid starvation or the abandonment of their homes. A few gentlemen of the city, differing in their political views, but fully agreeing in the necessity of prompt action to afford relief to those suffering people, conceived the idea of an organized effort to supply them with stock, agricultural implements, and seed to enable them to resume their farming operations and provide bread for their families. It was not proposed to place them in the attitude of paupers receiving charity, but to furnish them at cost with such articles as they required, and take a bond for repayment out for the next crop or soon thereafter as possible. So of course this was definitely a humanitarian issue, but these businessmen of Baltimore had that economic incentive to get the valley producing goods as the utmost importance. Now a number of men, as you can see on this list, came to the assistance of the society and offered up their names in credit. And that's going to total about $77,000 in 1865, which is the modern equivalent of about $1.1 million. Now, another thing that really aided in this effort were the transportation lines came to the aid by either offering discounted rates or charging no rates whatsoever to move the supplies. Two examples are the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Rappahannock steamers. So you can see there's a lot that was purchased to be able to make this a successful endeavor. Now from County Agent of Winchester, Virginia, James Burgess, he states how this all affected the local residents. The horses, agricultural implements, seed, grain, etc., furnished by the society has enabled our farmers, many of them who otherwise could not have done so, to get small crops of wheat this fall and make more extended preparations for the crops for next spring, the benefits of which must be largely felt in another year. So beautiful wheat. Sadly, I don't have an old image, so we use a modern image of wheat. The wheat production in the valley is going to rebound and increase by 10% in the 1860s. The farmers also concentrated more heavily on a number of other branches of agriculture, such as grass farming, dairying, and apples. Today, apple orchards are huge in the Shenandoah Valley, so much so that we have a huge apple blossom festival in Winchester in early May. Now, during the period from 1870 to 1900, Valley farmers continued to produce wheat in record amounts. Indeed, they produced vastly more wheat during these 3 decades than they had during the 3 decades prior to 1870. Also remarkable is the degree to which the levels of wheat production in the valley exceeded those of Virginia as a whole during this period. Now, from 1870 to 1900, as wheat production in the portion of Virginia outside of the valley rose by 3%, but production in the valley region will increase by 67%. And it's funny because as I've been doing this interpretation since 2010, I always wondered how this all rebounded the way it did. So this has been a great lesson to learn. I wondered how much the burning of the valley helped kind of rejuvenate the land, but I see very much it had to do with the economics of the situation with their business partners in Baltimore. So very interesting. That's why I love it, always learning something new. So by 1900, the valley's agricultural economy certainly rebounded. Yet let's take a step back and look at those first months after the surrender as farmers began to work on economic recovery and began to till the soil. Of course, they would be faced with another horror and reminder of war. Now, I don't know if I should say sadly, I have not been able to find an image of what it would have been like after the war finding bodies. This is actually from the battlefield, I believe Spotsylvania in May '64. But I can't imagine being out there trying to restart your life after such a difficult period of time and digging up former Confederate and Union soldiers. And this is where we're going to have amazing women step forward to start taking care of these problems. Winchester resident Mary Dunbar Williams was upset by the lack of proper burials by those she felt had given their lives for her home. In May of 1865, Mary will visit her sister, Eleanor Williams Boyd, and recounted the story of a farmer who plowed up 2 Confederate soldiers in his field. Now, sadly, the record doesn't state where. I'm going to assume she's from Winchester, that it occurred in Frederick County, which could mean that it could have been 1st Winchester, 2nd Winchester, 3rd Winchester, 1st Kernstown, 2nd Kernstown, countless skirmishes, but I think you get the point. Winchester claims that it changed hands 77 times, I believe. So if you can imagine how these fields were strewn with bodies that didn't have proper burials, I can understand why these 2 sisters were upset. These 2 women decided to call for a meeting among all of the women who had helped in the hospitals during the war, with the objective of forming a memorial society to gather these bodies and inter them in a proper burial site, as well as creating an annual tradition of placing flowers and evergreens on these graves. So less than a month after General Robert E. Lee will surrender at Appomattox, the first Ladies Memorial Association will spring up in Winchester, Virginia. These Ladies Memorial Associations organized to honor and eulogize the fallen South. Now, within that year, white Southern women from Virginia to Alabama followed suit, establishing no less than 70 Ladies Memorial Associations. Are you folks familiar with the Ladies Memorial Associations, LMAs? No? No? Raise your hand if it's no. Yeah, okay, that's pretty common. And I'm so grateful for this book. Historian Caroline Janney wrote Burying the Dead But Not the Past, the Ladies Memorial Associations and the Lost Cause. And she focuses on Ladies Memorial Associations in Virginia. And I'm crediting her with this next part that I talk about because she did the bare bones of this research. And she dissects why so many of us have not heard of what I will call the LMAs from here forward. Janney feels that historians may have overlooked the relevance of women and gender in memorializing the past, especially between 1865 and 1890, because most have focused on the national organizations such as the United Confederate Veterans or the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, because of this national scope, not only have they disregarded community-based groups such as the LMAs, but they've also failed to examine the fractures within post-war memory and the cyclical nature of Confederate remembrance. Likely, historians have vastly underestimated the number of women involved in the efforts to enshrine the lost cause, proposing that only a number had the energy, resources, and inclination to do so. Now, evidence from Virginia proves that a solid core of dedicated women emerged as early as 1865 and 66 to serve as guardians for what they deemed to be their sacred past. Still stays with us today, doesn't it, as Gettysburg learned yesterday. Now, furthermore, these organizations did not disappear by the 1870s, but endured well into the 20th century. And like the Lost Cause as a whole, the LMAs experienced a depressed interest in the late 1870s and 1880s, but the associations managed to revitalize themselves and continue to influence the Lost Cause traditions for several more decades. Now, these women of the LMAs, and not the United Daughters of the Confederacy, nor the Confederate Veterans, were responsible for remaking the defeat into a political, social, and cultural victory for the white South. They redefined what it meant to be both an ex-Confederate and a Southern lady. Interesting when you get into the gender roles. Women certainly had their place during this time in society, and through Caroline's examination, she saw how these genders worked together to fulfill their mission, so to speak. And from what she found, the men and women in Winchester really worked together, and it's going to produce great results. And ultimately, the idea was that the men and women agreed that because the ladies were by nature disinterested in politics, that their motives must be pure. So women were kind of given that go-ahead to lay the groundwork for commemoration immediately after the war. The LMA women secured the foundation for national reconciliation of Northern and Southern whites by providing the domestic legitimization of mourning that Confederate men lacked or felt that they would be allowed to do without being considered treasonous. So as I mentioned, the male-female dynamic apparently varied very greatly between each organization, but I focused particularly in Winchester. And what they did is that the ladies in Winchester selected a committee of 6 men to superintend and organize the removal of the Confederate bodies. The women would preside over Memorial Day activities, and the number of men involved in the reburial process appears to have been substantially higher in Winchester than in other cities. Now, the city also claimed both an independent women's society and a male-female association. And in the spring of 1866, the women of the Winchester LMA had joined with the men to form the Monumental Association of Stonewall Cemetery. Now, although the Winchester ladies remained an independent organization from its inception, those two sisters, both Williams and Boyd, served as vice president within the 11-member Monument Association. So the women and men appear to have worked well together, as there are no records of disputes among them. Now again, these women controlled the nature of memorial days, the reinterment process, and all other matter of bereavement. And keeping consistent with the Victorian-era propriety, the men spoke on behalf of these women at public events. But everybody knew that the ladies ran the show. So how do you finance such a huge endeavor? Imagine trying to move thousands of bodies, buying land, burying them, headstones, monuments, etc. So what do? Fundraise. And in the summer of 1865, the ladies of the Winchester LMA met frequently and continued to forward with their efforts to locate the graves of the Confederate dead surrounding the town. And by late fall, they issued an appeal to the entire South for aid. The appeal described the destruction of the valley and noted the dead were generally buried where they fell, and their rude graves are fast disappearing beneath the feet of men and beasts. So newspapers in Virginia and into the Deep South explained that Winchester's resources had been greatly reduced by war, and it states, "We are therefore induced to appeal to you for aid in this matter, encouraged by the belief that you will feel it privilege as well as duty to pay this tribute of respect to the memory of those who fell for our cause." Now, because every former Confederate state was represented among the fallen, the Winchester's Lady Memorial Association believed that each should feel obligated to help with this town effort. And despite the wide range devastation across the entire South, donations for this new cemetery poured in. By spring of 1866, Winchester had received $14,000 in donations. It's pretty remarkable. So with that, the WLMA, in conjunction with the Stonewall Memorial Association, purchased 5 acres for a Confederate cemetery to be named after General Stonewall Jackson. These calls throughout the South for aid would continue through the years, as well as women paying annual fees and dues to make sure that their treasury remained flush. So here's the layout of the Stonewall Cemetery. Williams and Boyd, as well as the Ladies Memorial Association across the South, used the National U.S. Cemetery here at Gettysburg as a template. The ladies grouped Confederate soldiers from the same state and designed a specific location for the unidentifiable remains. Winchester listed among their goals the erection of a monument for each state of the South as well in the cemetery. Now, Williams and Boyd organized a public meeting at which they assigned a group of men to begin collecting the remains of the bodies for reinterment prior to the upcoming summer heat. By late May, men employed by the Winchester LMA collected the dead from a radius of 15 miles around the Stonewall Cemetery and buried them in the individual graves. Within a year, the Winchester LMA had directed the reinterment of 2,489 Confederate soldiers, providing separate lots for the dead of each state and a section for 859 of the unknown dead. We have a connection to Gettysburg buried at Stonewall Cemetery. On July 3rd, 1863, 23-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Waller Tazewell Patton of the 7th Virginia was mortally wounded here at Gettysburg. He died 18 days later at Pennsylvania College. 14 months later, on September 19, 1864, Walter's older brother, Colonel George Patton of the 22nd Virginia, was killed in action at the Third Battle of Winchester. Both men were buried at Stonewall Cemetery. Now, decades later, when this picture was taken, George S. Patton, so we've got the Patton brothers buried here, and decades later, the grandson, famed World War II general, George S. Patton Jr., featured here on the right. So, see, another reason to come to Winchester. You can go visit this grave. So we've been talking a lot about the Confederate process, but also the Federals start organizing their national cemeteries. And Winchester National Cemetery was established on land appropriated for burials during the Civil War. And although the land was used for burial processes as early as 1862, the cemetery was not officially dedicated until April 8, 1866. And the land was not legally transferred to the U.S. government until December 1st, 1870, when the land was purchased properly from the owner. Now, Winchester National Cemetery has nearly 4,400 Union soldiers from the area's battles resting there, and containing 15 monuments. So the Winchester National Cemetery is right next to where the Stonewall Cemetery is. So another very poignant experience. I know that Gettysburg, right? Cemetery, synonymous with this battlefield, but these are beautiful grounds to walk as well. Now, Memorial or Decoration Days were celebrated in the spring as a sign of renewal and rebirth, but each community chose its own symbolic date to which to gather. Now, this is an image at Stonewall Jackson's grave down in Lexington. And maybe you guys know, because I couldn't find a definitive source. I saw some references that this was the first Memorial Day in Lexington, and then I didn't see other sources noting that, so I don't know if this is just a day that they were out at the general's grave or if this was actually indeed a Memorial Day for them. But I think it's a fitting image because, of course, we don't have enough photography from this period. Now, the women in Winchester chose June 6th as their inaugural day, and that was to commemorate one of their heroes, Turner Ashby, who was killed on that date in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Now, the women of the LMAs gathered on the days preceding the event to make evergreen and floral arrangements and requested that young men or boys perform any of the physical work, such as remounding. And on Memorial Day, hundreds and even thousands of citizens would gather at some central location, whether it be a town hall or a church, and then march in procession to the cemetery where the ladies and children would decorate these graves. Orators would be chosen by the women, and they would deliver prayers and evocative speeches. Now, on June 6, 1866, the businesses in Winchester would close for the town's inaugural Memorial Decoration Day. 300 former Confederates, primarily survivors of the Stonewall and Arnold LZ Brigade, were followed by 14 young girls who were wearing white dresses with black sashes, accompanied other citizens as a procession traveling from the Episcopal Church to the new cemetery. Now, upon reaching the site, the women and girls again decorated every grave with wreaths and garlands of fresh flowers. Now, afterwards, 3 speakers, all whom were Confederate majors, paid tribute to the fallen soldiers. Now, as events like this began to emerge across the South, Northerners were questioning what the motive of these events really were. And for the Southern men to avoid cries of treason from the North, they consciously framed the day's blatant display of Confederate patriotism within the domestic sphere of women. As Major Earl Wright proclaimed, "The mothers and daughters of Virginia are the chief mourners and actors in these touching obsequies." These women certainly could not be viewed as traitorous. They were simply exhibiting the qualities that we loved of 19th century women. The ideology that were attributed to these women were sentiment, emotion, and devotion to one's menfolk. So under the direction of the ladies, these Memorial Days proved legitimate venues for ex-Confederate veterans to march into towns, for thousands of white Southerners to gather in central locations, and for former generals and political figures to praise the Confederate cause in a public forum. Protected by their gender, white women were able to escape charges of treason during this Reconstruction period, for which men as political beings would have been found guilty. So they had their big event on June 6th, but they're going to have another very large event by October, and it's in honor of this gentleman. Turner Ashby, as I mentioned, was killed on June 6, 1862 during Jackson's campaign in the Valley. He would be buried at the University of Virginia Cemetery. Now, he also had a brother by the name of Richard who was killed on Kelly Island, Maryland in 1861. And he was buried at Indian Mound Cemetery in Romney, which then would have been Virginia, but today West Virginia. Now, in August of 1866, a letter was written to the Ashby's sisters on behalf of the Women's Ladies Memorial Association. The LMA claimed, "There are none to whom guardianship of these remains would be more appropriately committed than those whose homes and firesides they tried to defend." The sisters willingly gave consent for these bodies to be exhumed and reinterred at Stonewall Cemetery. So in early October, men hired by the LMA exhumed both bodies and prepared them for transfer to Winchester. Ashby's body was placed in an elaborate walnut coffin, black drapes, gold platings. Quite an image, I can only imagine. Now, the bodies were first transported to Charlestown, West Virginia, and then on to Winchester. The hearse was drawn by 4 white horses, accompanied by 60 former military officers and local officials, winding its way through the valley communities until ultimately reaching Stonewall Cemetery. The elaborate processional must have been a spectacle reminiscent of Confederate military parades during the war. On October 25th, nearly 10,000 people turned out, according to the Winchester Times. Former Governor and Confederate General Henry Wise was the keynote speaker, and he invoked the memory of Stonewall Jackson, stating, "The captain of our salvation was conquered. He died that the cause might live. A lost cause. If lost, it was false. If true, it is not lost." Now, as historian William Blair points out, Turner Ashby had been reinterred in a town which he never lived, in a cemetery named after Stonewall Jackson, in a town where he never lived and where he is not buried, at a dedication whose keynote speaker was a die-hard rebel. How could Northerners look upon this event as anything other than pro-Confederate political behavior? Now, Memorial Days allowed ex-Confederates to honor their war dead, but these services also provided an opportunity for white Southerners to devise their own interpretation and model of the Southern race relations during this very uncertain period post-war. Even though the ladies overwhelmingly tended to avoid conversations and discussions of race, they made concerted effort to praise the instances of African American loyalty to their former masters. Now, there is an account of during Winchester's inaugural Memorial Day that several African Americans joined ex-Confederates in the processional to Stonewall Cemetery. So that leads us to the next question. What was life like for African Americans in the Valley during Reconstruction? Now, I think it's interesting to note that by 1870, the census record shows 5,000 less blacks living in the Valley than there were in 1860. Politics. Reconstruction. Of course, this term refers to the effort made by the United States between 1865 and 1877 to restructure the political, legal, and economic systems in the states that had seceded from the Union. The Civil War had ended slavery, but it left unanswered how the 11 southern states would conduct their internal affairs after readmission to the Union. Though some legal protections for the newly freed slaves were incorporated in the Constitution by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, by 1877, conservative Southern whites had reclaimed power and had begun to disenfranchise blacks. So for the African American community, many would show great agency in trying to create the best lives for themselves during such an uncertain time. And I'd like to introduce you to this woman, Bethany V. So far, this is the only slave narrative that I have found from an enslaved Shenandoah Valley person. It's a remarkable story. It's about 40 pages long. You can Google it, Bethany V. Slave Narrative. Originally, she was owned by a man by the name of James Fletcher down in Luray, Virginia. And she gives an account of what she remembers of what life was like when she was 9 years old. She states, "I was put with a woman who gave me my food and clothes for whatever work I could do for her. She was kind to me, as I then counted kindness, never whipping or starving me, but it was not what a freeborn white child would have found comforting or needful." Now, her story is remarkable. She goes through some of the worst experiences an enslaved woman could. But through the luck of life, for lack of a better term, she is ultimately purchased by two Northerners from Providence, Rhode Island. They move her north and free her. So this is before the war came. And I want to share with you some of her stories, because often what I find most remarkable is when you get into discussions of slavery or even the post-war period, why did they stay? If they had a chance to go, why didn't they go? And I think Bethany offers some incredible insight, even though she knew she was in a much better place, as to how unsettling it might have all been. She says, "A new life had come to me. I was in a land By its laws, I had the same rights to myself that any other woman had. No jailer could take me to prison and sell me at auction to the highest bidder. My boy was my own, and no one could take him from me. But I had left behind everyone I had ever known. I did not forget the dreadful hardships I had endured, and yet somehow I did not think of them with half the bitterness through which I had endured them. I was a stranger in a strange land, and it was no wonder, perhaps, that a dreadful loneliness and homesickness had come over me. Now, Betty most likely spoke for scores of Southern migrants when she stated simply, "It was not easy at first to accommodate myself to these new surroundings. In the Southern kitchen under slave rule, there was little thought of convenience or economy. Here I found all sorts of Yankee inventions and improvements to make work easy and pleasant. There were dishes and pans of every description, clean and distinct cloths for all purposes, brushes and brooms for different purposes. I couldn't help feeling bewildered sometimes at the differences in so many ways, and yet for a moment wished myself back in old Virginia with my own people, and I very, very often longed to see the old familiar faces and hear the old sounds, but never could I forget to be grateful for my escape from a system under which I had endured." Now, ultimately, she's going to move to Worcester. My apologies to any Massachusetts residents. I can never pronounce that right. Worcester, Massachusetts, where she joins the mostly white Park Street Methodist Church. And she explains, "I was treated with such kind consideration by the brothers and sisters there that I was at home with them." And Betty is now, in her life, finding a community of friends. And here is an image of Betty later in life from the Worcester Historical Museum. Now, just as emancipated slaves in the South sought land ownership as a means for achieving independence, former slaves who migrated north wanted homes that they could call their own. Property ownership to secure the autonomy denied them in slavery. Aunt Betty describes this dream. "I have imagined myself working hard and carefully saving my earnings, then getting a little home with a little garden. While that dream would be delayed, she, like many of her counterparts, nevertheless fulfilled her dream in Worcester after the Civil War. And by 1870, nearly half of the migrants to that city lived in independent households." Now, Vini drew on Worcester's support network and played an active role in aiding migration of her extended Virginia family northward. She managed to save money during the years of war, and she would ultimately return to Virginia at war's end, seeking her daughter Charlotte, whom she had had to leave behind when she was purchased and freed by the Northerners. To great joy, she found Charlotte grown to womanhood and married with a child. The reunited family returned north to Massachusetts, where Charlotte, her husband, and their child resided with Vini. Vini traveled to Virginia 3 additional times on the same journey, as she stated, bringing back with me from time to time all 16 relatives, most of whom resided with or near her. By the 1880s, she had purchased her own home on the west side of the city, housed her daughter and her family near me in an adjacent house that she also owned, which I just think is a remarkable conclusion to such a dramatic story. But here is an example of 16 people leaving the Shenandoah Valley to find a better life for themselves. One woman who was able, through her own will and through her support network of her northern community, to rebuild her family by moving them to Worcester. In the South, an agency was formed with the intention of providing support for these newly freed people. Let's take a look at what the Freedmen Bureau was and some of their records from the Valley. In good governmental style, The title is The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, as we all know today as the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by the War Department on March 3rd, 1865. So we just passed that anniversary. Now, very lucky that these records were available online, and I spent a good amount of time going through the records from June of 1865 through May of 1866. That was kind of tedious. A lot of people had no food, a lot of people had no firewood. But there were some accounts of white on black, black on white crime, and I'm going to share some of these stories with you to kind of get a sense of what being black in post-war Reconstruction era of Virginia was. Now on March 31st, 1866, Assistant Superintendent reported the murder of a colored man by the name of Bennett McCord in Berryville, Virginia. He was killed by a white man named Theodore Dooley. Dooley has not been arrested as of yet. Jump forward a month to April 30th. The report states the murder of Bennett McCord still at large. The record ends. There was no more mention of either of those two names through the records I went through. Now on May 31st, 1866, there was a report of an assault on Chazzy Brown, colored, by Ellis Harris, white, with a pistol. Justices refused to issue a warrant. Now I came across probably the most compelling account by the Assistant Superintendent of Clark County in April of 1866. And there are so many layers in this account. He writes, "But few cases of difficulty have been reported to me, either among the freedmen or between them, their employees or citizens, the latter themselves being witnesses, often testifying to the general good behavior, industry, and improvement, to their surprise, of their former slaves. Many freedmen are cultivating farms on shares, receiving from 2/3 to 3/5 of the products, which plan there could be no doubt will work to the mutual interest and satisfaction of all parties interested. There are few but aged dependent freedmen, and in many cases by aiding them somewhat, furnishing them rations and clothing, they can be made comfortable until another winter when it is presumed the county will be better prepared to provide them at its poorhouse. The citizens in general appear to be submissive to the results of war and emancipation, but I am fully convinced that the presence of the military or bureau officers or agents, that the treatment of the colored people by a portion of the estate holders and others would make their condition very uncertain, and I fear worse, if possible, than when slaves. I trust this would not be the general fact, but to a great extent, I am sure it would." So, saying everything on the surface looks good, but he's pretty sure that if the federal officers were gone, that potentially a situation worse than slavery would be rebuilt in its place. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau gives us a limited glimpse through through the records of daily life in the Valley, but let's look at how media was portraying white supremacy in the Valley. And this is the Clark Courier, and there was an editor by the name of William H. Nelson who used this paper to encourage whites' supremacy and to minimize African American agency. Now, the Clark Courier kept county residents well informed of African American criminal activity both locally and nationally. And there's 3 reasons. First of all, this frequent appearance of blacks getting into trouble showed them that there's no way black men could provide for their own. Weekly reports of petty crime kept whites well aware. It reminded them of the time when the enslaved Africans would do everything in their power to try to show their own agency through theft. And the 3rd reason was purely political. Nothing could convey the real and imagined threat imposed by African Americans better than the Clark Courier's coverage of rape. Now, petty crimes, which were annoying and objectionable to the social order, did not generate the same amount of fear and paranoia. Yet, crime of that violence was very rare in the region. So Nelson often used rape cases reported regionally and nationally to keep things stirred up. Now, by August of 1869, there is going to be a hanging of 2 alleged black rapists in Front Royal. And Nelson's byline will read, "As it should be." October 27th, he will issue in support of vigilante mobs, noting, "We are in measure remitted to our natural self-defense, as 4 million of these semi-savages have been turned loose on us." So these are the media reports. And I think we all understand what media bombardment can do to one's sanity. Now, during the 1869 election, Nelson asked white men of Clark, "Are you willing to have the Negro as your social equal and associate of yourself, your wives, your sons, and your daughters?" Now, as reports from the Freedmen's Bureau and daily messages from the papers show, the African Americans in Clark County still faced high levels of oppression and intense scrutiny. Virginia will ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments in the fall of 1869, and on January 26, 1870, Congress ended military Reconstruction and readmitted Virginia with full rights. Now, as African Americans realized that although they could not escape restorations of white supremacy, the all-black community better shielded them and at least provided temporary relief from the most insidious aspects of white control. Now, out of the crucible of slavery, African Americans in Clark County will forge 11 black communities. And this is Miss Ellen Jett McCormick. Her husband will die in 1870. And the farm that they had is called Claremont Farm. It's an active working farm today in collaboration with Virginia Tech. Preservation is utmost there. And as the folks at Claremont will say, it's like Ellen is like Scarlett O'Hara trying to save Tara. She's trying to save the core historic property, and she's going to start selling off land. Now, she's having trouble selling off some of the acreage, and one of her former enslaved seamstresses, Josephine, will come to her on behalf of 16 black families, totaling 93 individuals. Josephine requests that Ellen subdivide 31 acres and finance it, which she agrees to do at $100 per acre at a 6% interest. So this development, Josephine City, is now a part of Berryville. It was the largest African American community in Clark County. Now, historian Kyle Ainsworth states the residents of Josephine City, past and present, do not owe the white community anything in their formation of their community. African Americans built it, they sustained it, and they are the reason that Josephine City continues to exist today. Now, in the aftermath of war, President Lincoln had said, "Americans will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and we lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." In the aftermath of war, it took great agency and perseverance for the people to rebuild their Shenandoah Valley. Here we saw just a glimpse of how various communities came together to rebuild their once and desolate valley back to life. With that, folks, I thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.